Good afternoon. I think we're going to get started. Well, good afternoon. I'm Roland Anglin. I'm the Dean of the Maxine Goodman Levin College of Urban Affairs, and welcome. I want to welcome you to the second annual Norm Krumholtz Lecture. Last year, we had Susan Feinstein, an eminent scholar in the planning field, kick off our inaugural lecture, and it was a great success. I expect no less success this year, given the presence of Professor Todd Swanstrom. Todd is one of the leading urban and regional scholars in the United States. It's no cliche to say that he is a seminal thinker and writer on the role of place and opportunity in our country. You know, his academic work is stellar, but he's one of the rare scholars who has achieved prominence in research and impact in the world of practice. Todd Swanstrom has used his position to actively engage in policy formulation. I first met Todd, 30 years ago, when he was at the University of Albany, and I was at Rutgers University. We were working on a long-forgotten project with the noted scholar practitioner, Richard Nathan. We stayed in touch over the years, and we worked together as part of an effort to build a learning network sponsored by the Democracy Collaborative, centered on higher educational institutions as drivers of community and economic development. So welcome, Todd. Now I want to turn to the reason for the Krumholtz Lecture. The Norm Krumholtz Lecture in the Future of Planning was one of the first things I advocated for when I got here as Dean. Norm's accomplishments need no recounting, but his legacy transcends the individual. The norms and values embodied in his scholarship and practice have come to define good planning in a way that will not soon be eclipsed. Nor should they. But these norms and values defining equity planning are a living force that should be examined through the lens of new challenges facing us as a profession, as a college, and as a society. So every year, we will begin by focusing on the future of planning by looking at robust and expansive base pioneered here at the Levin College. I want to close my welcome by giving a special greeting to our alums who are in attendance. This is homecoming week, and we know that we are proud of your accomplishments and your impact in the world beyond these walls. So welcome, and hope you will have a great afternoon. And now I'd like to ask Chris Ronayne to come up and introduce Todd Swanstrom.
Thank you, Dean, and good afternoon, everybody. I am delighted to be here for the second annual Equity Planning Symposium, and among other things, every year it's a chance to say thanks to Norm Krumholtz. I won't belabor it, but he knows how I feel about him. I had the great distinction to be his graduate assistant here at the Levin College, and was always reminded of what a privilege that was. I'll never forget being in the little red brick building next door and seeing a stream of SUNY Buffalo students walking through on an exchange between Levin and SUNY Buffalo's planning program, and every one of the students was armed with their book, their copy of Making Equity Planning Work. And I'll never forget how proud I was to be his graduate assistant as they were streaming in to see the great Norm Krumholtz. The same year I went to the APA, National APA Conference. The first year I got to go and went as a student with Student APA, and I quickly realized you couldn't get through a crowd with Norm Krumholtz because everybody wanted to stop and talk and get his advice. That was in Orlando that we were there, and I missed the next session, but it was worth every minute of it. And the third time I realized who I was working for as a graduate assistant was actually from Mayor Carl Stokes. How quickly I was able to get a coffee date with Carl Stokes because I had the good distinction of being Norm's GA. And what great respect the legendary Mayor Carl Stokes had for Norm, and then heard again from his son this past summer with the Cuyahoga 50 celebration when Cordell Stokes, a son of Carl Stokes, and Chucky Stokes, the nephew of Carl Stokes, came in and gave a great talk about their dad and their uncle at Nautica Pavilion about the river and about Mayor Stokes' relationship with the river and what he did to advance our city and clean water and the environment vis-a-vis that crisis. And then Cordell walked off the stage and he says, "How's Norm Krumholtz doing?" I said, "Pretty good. I don't see him as much anymore. He's got a girlfriend he's out of town sometimes with, but pretty good as far as I know." And he said, "Well, when you see him," and I did tell Norm this, he said, "Tell him he was my dad's favorite cabinet member." So that's Norm Krumholtz. Thank you for putting us on the map at Levin College, and thank you for putting a conscience in our minds as students and as students of you always in life. It is good to be here for the second year and co-chair this with Dean Anglin. I'm really excited about what we're about to hear from Todd Swanstrom in the panel discussion subsequent. It's also APA Ohio's week. I see Chris out there. Chris Dursey, thank you. We are happy that you're here. Maybe some of you came by way of the state conference that's going on, but this is, I think, a really great opportune moment to kick it off a day early with APA Ohio. We're here, to talk further about equity planning today and the relationship with the conundrums of gentrification and other matters in the urban dynamic here in Cleveland and beyond. But I think when we look at the national APA, going back to that, it is a true testament to Norm that, as you know, if you've been to an APA conference of late, it has, alas, maybe 50 years too late, but finally, equity is everywhere in the conversations about planning and at the conferences themselves, and it will be again this week, as it should be, just as economic development is and transportation is and the environment and regional neighborhood planning. Equity should not only be a cohort that we learn about, but it should be integrated throughout all of those programs in our discourse nationally, regionally, and locally. So today's the 95th birthday of Jimmy Carter. President Carter is down in Georgia. I happened to be in Atlanta last week. Didn't see President Carter, but learned it was going to be his birthday on Monday, and so happy birthday to President Carter. I know a young, and actually younger than Jimmy Carter, is Norm Krumholtz, who served on a committee with President Carter and when President Carter was in office on housing and community development. That was 40-some years ago. It's also 40-some years ago from the Concentric administration in Cleveland, which Todd Swanstrom wrote quite a bit about in his book, The Crisis of Growth Politics. Both of those individuals, President Carter and Congressman, then Mayor Kucinich, obviously were very committed to cities like Cleveland and Cleveland itself. But I think both would ask, and we should all ask, how are we doing 40 plus years as cities go? I think we look around at our metro and other metros, and every metro is distinct, every center city is distinct within the metro, but there's winners and losers, depending on the indices. When it comes to poverty indicators, we are clearly worse off in Cleveland than even before, and even at the time of our Great Recession in 2008, we are worse off. Today, 33% of Cleveland residents live in poverty, with a staggering 50.5%, 50+% of children in the city of Cleveland in poverty. In Cuyahoga County, 216,000 people live in poverty. 124,000 of those from Cuyahoga County living in poverty come from the center city of Cleveland. The balance, 92,000, coming from our suburbs. 57.4% of Cuyahoga County's poverty problem is here in the city of Cleveland. The data manager for the Plain Dealer, Rich Exner, who concluded in this story that ran last week, he concluded, Greater Cleveland home prices are up in many places, and the unemployment rate is down overall since the recession of a decade ago, but a fresh set of data released by the U.S. Census Bureau provides a stark reminder that recovery hasn't been for all. Enter equity planning. Nationally, 4 cities have higher poverty rates than Cleveland's, 33.1%. They are Bloomington, 33.8%, Detroit, 33.4%, Flint, 34.7%, Camden, New Jersey, 40.9%. I was asked to just make a couple of maybe provocative comments before introducing Todd, so Aaron, wherever you are, that's what I'm doing. This next part, perhaps provocative, perhaps controversial, but perhaps a conversation started to flow through Keisha's panel and with Norm and Todd. Down the road from Camden, New Jersey, city Philadelphia, a group of us from Cleveland visited a number of months back. Among other speakers, we heard from, and some of the economists and professors here know, the late Jeremy Nowak. Before his passing, he reminded us in Cleveland, first of all, that he loved Cleveland and he was rooting for the Cleveland Browns. Well, he's finally getting his wish somewhere. There was a win. But we all too often in Cleveland actually are spending too much time, in my opinion, thinking about box scores and in the ether of sports, forgetting about the bigger problems that present us in Cleveland. What he admonished in all of us as a Cleveland delegation in Philadelphia, visiting and learning from the city of Philadelphia, this is the controversial part, is when asked about gentrification, he said, stay out of the fact-free zone. Focus on the facts. Your foremost problem in Cleveland is poverty. Said well before Rich Exner's analysis of the U.S. Census Bureau statistics last week. It's true that gentrification exists in a number of census tracts, yes. But in the mass majority of your census tracts, you have an income problem. I'll never forget that analysis by Nowak, as it is a reality check on today's conversation. Nowak's colleagues at Brookings later wrote, in most cities, it is not gentrification that is widening the gap between people and communities who are succeeding in this economy and those who are not. It is the rise of poverty. My sense is that we are different from Boston and San Francisco. We are uniquely Cleveland. And that the fundamental challenge before us today is corroborated by the facts of the U.S. Census statistics, is that Cleveland has a significant poverty problem. And it's exactly where the discussion of equity planning needs to be and needs to stay. I'll be interested to hear what our colleagues have to say on the subject as we open up the second annual Equity Planning Symposium. And with that, it is my honor to introduce and reintroduce to Dean Anglin's beginning introductory of Dr. Todd Swanstrom, our guest speaker for the 2019 Future of Urban Planning Lecture. A professor of community collaboration and public policy administration at the University of Missouri St. Louis, UMSL. By the way, Dr. Swanstrom, I very quickly talked, there are great parallels between the city of St. Louis and the city of Cleveland, and there are great distinctions as well. But I noted right away that Todd Swanstrom has a love in his heart for Cleveland, Ohio. He specializes in urban politics and public policy, has an MA from Washington University and a PhD from Princeton. Prior to joining UMSL, Todd taught at St. Louis University and the Rockefeller College of Public Affairs and Policy at University of Albany, SUNY. He also worked as a neighborhood planner in Cleveland and as a director of strategic planning for the city of Albany, New York. Todd's book, The Crisis of Growth Politics, Cleveland, Kucinich, and the Challenge of Urban Populism, won the Best Book Award from the urban section of the policy of APSA. His co-authored Place Matters, Metro Politics for the 21st Century, won the Michael Harrington Award from the New Politics section of the Michael Harrington Award of New Politics section of the APSA. And in 2011, he published and co-edited his volume, Justice in American Metropolis, which develops the idea of think injustice. He is presently working on the book tentatively entitled The Good Neighborhood, Why It's Threatened, and What We Can Do About It. Todd has used the resources of his endowed professorship to support Community Builders Network of Metro St. Louis, which is working to build great neighborhoods throughout the St. Louis region. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome back to Cleveland, Dr. Todd Swanstrom.
Thank you. Is this mic working? Oh, okay, great. Wow, good technology. Thank you for the generous introduction, Chris and Roland. Thank you. It's so great to be back in Cleveland. 40 years ago, Cleveland changed my life. Just a quick story. In 1979, I was a student in political theory at Princeton in the Department of Politics, and I tried to come up with a dissertation topic, and every topic I came up with kind of went like this. They're supposed to go like this, right? And I was pretty frustrated. I was driving a taxi, and I put food on the table, and I was walking the streets of New York one day, and I ran into this big, tall guy, a friend of mine in the graduate school at Princeton, by the name of Ron Berkman. I think you've heard of him. I didn't think he'd be here, but Ron asked me, well, would you be interested in maybe working on an article comparing Cleveland and New York? And I've been talking to The Nation magazine, and what do you think about this, Todd? So we sat down and we wrote this article we published it, called A Tale of Two Cities, which is probably the most cliched, overused title for an article, now. Apologies to Charles Dickens, but it fits so well, sometimes you just have to use it, right? So after we published this article, I said to myself, well, maybe I should write a dissertation on Cleveland, right? This is pretty interesting stuff. So I wrote a letter to the mayor of Cleveland, Dennis Kucinich. Dear Mayor Kucinich. I attached a copy of the article, which, by the way, generally had a somewhat favorable view of Kucinich compared to Koch, right, in terms of tax abatements and things like that. And I said, I'd be willing to work for your administration for free if you let me come and study your administration and write about it in my dissertation. And about a week later, I got a call from Bob Weissman, his chief lieutenant, offering me a job over the phone. I hadn't mentioned it to my wife at the time, but which I don't recommend you doing this, by the way. You want to warn them if you're applying for a job in Cleveland, especially if you don't live there at the time, right? So it's a little bit of a shock to her. And within a week or so, I got in my Volkswagen and drove to Cleveland to take a job in city government. I remember going up I-77 and looking at the smokestacks, spewing smoke out, and I thought, wow, I'm coming to the industrial heartland to be with the working class, struggling against the corporate elites. It turned out the Kucinich administration was a little more complex than that if you read my book, but at least had that sense in the beginning. I worked in the CETA program in the Community Development Department as a neighborhood planner, wrote my dissertation on the Kucinich administration, and as Chris mentioned, published it as The Crisis of Growth Politics. And it was at this time that I met this gentleman, Norm Krumholtz. I interviewed you, if you remember, for my dissertation. Just as important, I read a bunch of the policy planning reports that your staff had put out over the years, which were absolutely eye-opening. They are written in plain English, which is really a breakthrough in planning reports. And they really helped me to understand what was going on in the city of Cleveland. When Roland asked me if I'd be willing to do this, as soon as you mentioned the Norm Krumholtz lecture, I said, well, yeah, of course, I'll do it, There's no doubt one of the favorite people in the whole world. It's just an honor to be asked to deliver this lecture, Norm, and you've been a mentor to a lot of people and a model. You've done this for over a half a century here in Cleveland, and thank you for not giving up, all those years. All right. So it really is an honor to be selected for this. So just a quick heads up on my plan for today. First, I want to contrast what it was like in 1979 and what it's like in 2019, okay? There's a change. We're in a different kind of city today. Then I want to talk about how equity planning needs to adapt to the new circumstance. It was really born in the 70s. It was born in the period of urban crisis. We're in a different period now, but we'll talk about that. And I want to talk about what I call the gentrification conundrum and the kind of dilemma that gentrification and the way we think about gentrification presents for equity planners. I'm going to focus my comments on St. Louis and Cleveland, but I believe that they have broader implications, but we can leave that aside for Q&A. And then at the end, I'll talk about some possible policies and maybe linguistic practices for dealing with the issues of gentrification, because there are symbolic issues that are just as important, I think, as the substantive issues. So let's start by talking about 1979, when I arrived in Cleveland. What was it like? It's hard to put your head back into what it was like in the 1970s in cities around the country, especially older industrial cities. White flight, middle-class flight to the suburbs, massive, rancorous race relations, riots, deindustrialization, fiscal crisis. It was intense, folks. Here is a map of population trends in Cleveland and St. Louis, and you can see the steepness of that line in the 70s. The graph doesn't really give you a sense of it, but let me give you some numbers that should, if you think about it, that should just absolutely shock you. Cleveland lost 24% of its population in the 1970s alone. In one decade, about 1/4 of the people left the city. Okay? St. Louis, by the way, beat you. We lost 30%. We are the #1 shrinking city in the world. From peak to trough, St. Louis has had the biggest drop in the entire world, according to a study of shrinking cities around the world, right? Cleveland is right up there, but it's hard to really understand how difficult it was back then. And of course, we had a certain amount of mordant humor that we used back in the 70s. Some of you will remember these. Some of these jokes will be tasteless, but it gives you a flavor of the times, right? I mean, you almost had to have a sense of humor. One of the jokes was, well, the last person to leave Cleveland, please turn out the lights. You've heard that before. And if 1/4 of the people leave in 10 years, it's almost not a joke, right? Let's see here. What's the difference between Cleveland and the Titanic? You all know that. Cleveland has a better orchestra, right? Yeah. So we would joke that planners were rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, right, Norm? And then the most off-color joke, which I'm going to tell anyway. It's like the old SAT exam. Which of the following does not fit in the sequence? Syphilis, herpes, AIDS, or a condominium in Cleveland? The answer is syphilis, because it's the only one you can get rid of. Okay, take you a while to figure that out. But anyway, these are all tasteless jokes. But so, getting a little more serious for the moment, how do we think about this process of urban decline? How did we conceptualize it? What was the dominant school of thought as we talked about this? And it was really originating from the Chicago school. I won't go into all the roots. This is concentric zone theory. This idea, it's a basic idea, we're all aware of this, that cities grow outward, right? That they have at the core, they have in the middle of the city is the downtown area, the central business district. Then you have a second zone, which is factories and abandoned buildings and deteriorated housing. Then you have working class housing, then you have residential zone, and finally you get out to the higher income residential areas on the outskirts. And according to the Chicago school, it's very straightforward, right? What is urban decline about? As people's incomes go up, they naturally want to move to newer housing, move to areas with more greenery, right? Move out of the old, obsolete housing. So according to the Chicago School of Human Ecology, the basic framework here, new is always better than old, single use is always better than mixed use. That is, people prefer to live in areas without industry and commerce mixed in, right, with residential areas. They're always going to prefer a modern city which has sorted out the functions so they don't interfere with each other. We don't have kind of industrial pollution and everything. And homogeneous is always better than diverse. Human beings prefer to be with others, birds of a feather flock together, so that racially diverse neighborhoods are going to do less well than homogeneous neighborhoods. And that includes ethnicity as well. So you have new is better than old, single use is better than mixed use, and homogeneous is better than diverse. So what does this create? A kind of neighborhood life cycle theory, which grew out of the Chicago school. And by the way, this theory was stated very directly in 1975 in a report by the Housing and Urban Development, U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. This is how neighborhoods change, right? They go through a life cycle. And they start out as healthy neighborhoods. They start to decline. They decline more. And then eventually you reach a stage of abandonment. After all, obsolete housing is obsolete, right? It's old. It's old-fashioned. It doesn't fit the modern times. It's going to need to be torn down. And then, of course, what we get is urban renewal. And we need to clear the land. We need to rebuild it. We need to rebuild it in a way that's modern, right? That includes the kind of project planning without perhaps the complexity of the urban grid and the mix of uses and the contamination that comes from that. And we can revitalize the city through urban renewal. So urban life cycle theory is very interesting, neighborhood life cycle theory. It obviously, descriptively, is somewhat accurate, right? There's no doubt that many old neighborhoods have been abandoned and bulldozed. In fact, people are moving outward all the time, right? So clearly, it's tapping into something that empirically, at least, is true, right? Higher income people tend to move further out into new housing on the suburban fringe. There's no doubt about that. So it's no doubt that in some ways, it's descriptively accurate. And racially integrated neighborhoods often don't do well. Whites often flee. There's decline, right? So there's a real truth to this, this theory. On the other hand, and I can't go into all the details here, but the theory is deeply flawed, right? It's really problematic, and it's problematic in ways that parallel the way I think the way we talk about gentrification is problematic, okay? So keep that in your heads, right? What is the problem with the Chicago School of Human Ecology and this notion of concentric zone and neighborhood life cycle. First, it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Those of you who know, how many of you know about the HOLC and the security maps and the way they were influenced by the Chicago School, Homer Hoyt, who advised the HOLC in the 1930s to create maps that mapped out the risk of mortgage failure, of a mortgage default by neighborhood, right? And those maps were used to determine when the federal government would give FHA and VA mortgage insurance, and they discriminated against neighborhoods that were racially diverse, that were a mix of use, and that were older. Because they assumed that older neighborhoods that mix uses, right, have commercial and other functions mixed in with the neighborhood, and are old, are not going to do well. But it's one thing to have a theory about the world, right? It's another thing to have the full faith and credit of the federal government behind your theory and making sure your theory comes true, right? Does everybody get that? So it wasn't like they just stood back and looked at the world and said, my theory reflects reality. They shaped reality through their theories. It was a massive program. It influenced private mortgage lending as well. Those were maps were used well into the 50s and 60s. The same sort of, the underwriting by private mortgage brokers was based upon this kind of notion, right? That certain kinds of neighborhoods are not going to do well. And that's where redlining came from when we talk about redlining. So that's one of the problems with the theory. It was actually used to shape reality, not just reflect reality. And secondly, urban renewal. It justified that land clearance and urban renewal at the end of the chain. When you get to a neighborhood that's very old, right, somewhat deteriorated, the conclusion was, of course, we've got to bulldoze it and clear it and build a new neighborhood, right? And when you, that is a very problematic. I won't go into the whole history of urban renewal, but if any of you have read Herb Gans's study of the West End in Boston, you know what I'm talking about. What he says, basically, this may have looked like a dilapidated neighborhood. It's an ethnic, largely Italian, Jewish neighborhood, right? Didn't look very nice. Some apartments, you know, were decrepit, but it was low-income housing. It was actually a strong community, and it was a viable community. And they came in and bulldozed it down under the assumption that it was going to fail. I'm not saying you never clear land, right? But this idea that all old neighborhoods are going down the tubes and we need to bulldoze them was highly problematic. So you've got this theory of the urban crisis period that really led to some problematic policies. And also, the main point I want to make here is this theory was overgeneralized. It was too abstract, right? It said that all neighborhoods go this way, right? This was a law. These were scientists. This is what happens. This is how neighborhoods change, right? It doesn't look at the particularities of time and place. Chicago School of Human Ecology grew up in a certain city at a certain time, and it's shaped by that history. And when you get to different times and different places, the world looks different, right? And to generalize from one city to an entire nation of cities, right, is highly problematic. Let me give you a quote from Homer Hoyt, an economist heavily influenced by the Chicago School from Chicago. Quote, let me quote you. High rent or high grade neighborhoods must almost necessarily move outward toward the periphery, right? Higher income is going to move outward of the city. The wealthy seldom reverse their steps and move backward into the obsolete houses which they are giving up. If there ever were a generalization, right, about how cities are going to develop, there it is, right? And I think if we think about it for a second, well, Mr. Hoyt, you know, it wasn't exactly true, right? Because we know that cities have undergone a change, that in many cases higher income people are now moving back into older parts of metropolitan areas, right? It's the topic of gentrification, right? So starting earlier, but in the 1990s it began to gather steam, and it's gathered steam ever since, and this is the topic I want to talk about today, gentrification. We talk about it, right? Completely contradicts what Hoyt said. Once again, however, I believe the way we use the term is overgeneralized and abstract and suffers from those same problems that the Chicago School of Neighborhood Succession, Neighborhood Life Cycle suffered from, okay? So that's the theme I want to develop. So some quick facts. When I left New York City in 1979, got in my Volkswagen, New York City was a lot like Cleveland, you know? It had horrible crime, it had decline, the South Bronx was burning, oh my God, it was a real crisis city. It was an urban crisis in New York. I don't know if you've looked at New York lately, but New York is doing pretty well. When I left in 1980, there were 2,245 murders in New York. Last year, there were 289, about 1/10 as many. New York is booming. You know, we can talk about super gentrification. There it is. We can talk about it more later. But this city is in a very different situation. I remember I read the Downs and Bradbury have a book on urban decline back in the 70s, and Boston was rated the most disadvantaged declined city in the country, ahead of St. Louis and Cleveland. Not so true today, right? So something happened in some cities, but it actually didn't just happen in some cities, it happened in cities all across the country, including older industrial cities like St. Louis, right, and Cleveland. So here's the population trends again. The thing I want to notice here, this is going back to that same graph, notice how the slope of the line changes. The slope of the line at the end is just about flat, folks. So the old joke about, will you please turn off the lights for the last person who leaves, you know, it just doesn't apply anymore, right? Is Tom Byer in the audience? Anyway, Tom is, oh, there he is. Okay, Tom wrote me some stuff. I think it was 1,600 people population decline last year, Tom, according to the census, right? Eventually, Tom was opining, and I agree, at some point it's going to stabilize, maybe even start growing. So something very different is happening, right? There's definitely some different dynamic going on here. Parts of the city, even more striking, parts of the city are growing rapidly while other parts of the city are declining. Chris referred to things like this. So, for example, downtown Cleveland, according to my numbers, is up 27% in population between 2000 and 2016 to reach a population of about 13,866. 13,000, almost 14,000 people living in downtown Cleveland, projected to reach 20,000 within a few years. I walked through downtown. It seems like there's cranes going up. So what is it, a 34-story rental building going up, something like that? Oh, wow, you know, we would have been blown away by this in 1979, right? The city of St. Louis tripled its downtown population during that same period from 2000 to 2016. We have 12,600, so you're a little ahead of us, but both cities are experiencing this downtown kind of revival. There's the clustering of new economy jobs. So what's happening in the modern economy is the new knowledge innovation economy has tremendous tendencies toward clustering in urban areas, right? Because bringing a lot of smart, highly educated people together increases their productivity and especially their innovation. So for example, here in University Circle in Cleveland, my understanding is about 50,000 people work in University Circle. Well, that medical complex there, if you want to know the latest techniques in surgery or whatever it is, you've got to be there, right? I got Mohs surgery. You got to have a certain, for my skin cancer, you got to have a certain amount of volume, right, to do Mohs surgery and have the most advanced techniques. Downtown Cleveland, which occupies 5% of the land of the city, has 48% of the jobs. It gives you an idea of the concentration, right? The jobs have moved out of the other parts of the city, but they're located in downtown. So educated professionals, and I did a little graph here, percentage of the population in these two cities with a BA or more is just soaring. St. Louis is ahead of you. Chris and I were talking about it a little bit. It seems like St. Louis is a little hotter in terms of this tech, you know, innovation hub, innovation district phenomenon, but both cities, young, educated people are moving into the city in droves. There's no people, many people have talked about this, right? So we've definitely got that. So, so how have people theorized about this new phenomenon, right? I told you how they theorized about urban decline, right? How have they theorized about this? In some ways, you could imagine it, it's like concentric zone model turned inside out, right? It's now, people are coming back, right? They were moving out, now they're coming back. And we have, according to some people, we have a new age of urban revival. Calling our era the Great Inversion, in 2012, Alan Ehrenhalt wrote, quote, "The truth is that we are living in a moment in which the massive outward migration of the affluent that characterized the second half of the 20th century is coming to an end." It's a pretty dramatic statement, right? Another observer commented about urban revival, quote, "Once Americans fled inner cities for suburban paradise, now an urban revival is making the suburbs the home of the poor." So there are these generalizations. We're in a new era of the city, the area of city revival, right? Gentrification, the term gentrification in my view, is the ultimate, it's kind of, once again, a reflection of the Chicago school, a generalized, abstract characterization of the new city, right? And I'm gonna want to develop some criticisms of the way we talk about gentrification, the way that concept has been developed. So, here's my experience of the gentrification phenomenon. You know, when I was at the State University of New York and then I took a job in St. Louis. My wife couldn't handle the winters in upstate New York, so I got a job at St. Louis University, the Jesuit University. I taught in the planning program there. And I got to St. Louis, and I knew it was the #1 shrinking city in the world. And, you know, and I started going around the neighborhoods, and I said, wow, you know, there's a few neighborhoods over here. They're experiencing reinvestment, and people are moving in. And, oh, my God, this is in about 2001, right, 2002. And so I go to my planning classes and say, yeah, it's interesting. There's all this problems. But over here, these neighborhoods over here, they're getting better. They're experiencing reinvestment. People are moving back in, fixing up the housing. And invariably, the response of my student was, but professor, that's gentrification. Oh, you know, it's like I got totally deflated. It's like Professor Swanstrom is kind of naive, right? He doesn't understand that it's gentrification. It's not good. This is bad, right? This is driving up the housing prices. And I was, you know, I was sort of nonplussed, you know, and frankly, once the word's out there, you know, it's hard to deal with it, right? I mean, so I've been spending the last 15 years trying to figure out, you know, what is my feeling about this? What do I react, right? What's the problem here? So what is gentrification? Well, this is the origins of the term. A lot of you know this. 1964, Ruth Glass, sociologist, wrote a book about London, wrote this: one by one, many of the working class quarters of London have been invaded, notice the word invaded, by the middle classes, upper and lower. Shabby, modest mews and cottages have been taken over when their leases have expired and have become elegant, expensive residences. Once this process of gentrification, the first use of the word, she invented the term, there it is, gentrification, starts in a district. It goes on rapidly until all or most of the original working class occupiers are displaced. This is 1964, right? And the whole social character of the district is changed. Little did Ruth Glass know she was coining a term that would go around the globe and become one of the most talked about phenomena with that term gentrification in the area of urban studies, right? It was a phenomenal invention of a word. I wish I could invent a word like that, right, that everybody used, 30, 40, 50 years later, right? I haven't quite got there. So you notice the word invasion, the word displacement. It's not just physical gentrification. The whole social character of the area changes, culturally, socially. It changes, right? And it also is rooted in this idea of what is often called rent gap theory, which is the idea that gentrification goes into the poorest areas, right? Not the middle areas, right? It goes into the poorest areas and transform them. So, you've got this, oops, there it is. According to Ruth Glass, we now have a new version, right, of neighborhood life cycle theory, if you follow this concept of gentrification, is that as neighborhoods go down, they get to a phase of accelerated decline, and bam, in come the gentrifiers, right? In come the developers, in come the banks, in come the gentry in to settle in those neighborhoods that have been disinvested. So that looks a little different than urban renewal, but it's got a similar kind of quality to it. If you read the literature, it's highly determinist, right? It's got a lot of force behind it. It's very hard to change it once it gets going. It's kind of this invasion succession. The Chicago School talked about neighborhood change as invasion and succession. It's got that quality of neighborhood invasion and succession. And as I said, this is sort of the mordant humor of the day, right? We had our jokes back in the 70s. Now the joke is this way. First whites live in the cities, right? And then minorities move into the cities and whites flee to the suburbs. Uh-oh, here we go. The crisis, the urban crisis. The whites move into the second ring suburbs. They move even further out, right? Uh-oh, we got a problem. Minorities move into the second ring suburbs, and then whites suddenly move back into the city, right? It's the way a lot of people think about gentrification, right? That the devaluation of the land, the abandonment in the center is a setup, really, for gentrification, right? It's going to come back in and displace. So you have this process, and there's been a huge scholarly literature on gentrification. Here is the number of articles written with the term gentrification appearing in the title. This was put together by my friend Alan Malik. According to Google Scholar, starting out in 1964, which there was 0, you'll notice back there, growing slightly. Since 2000, it's been astronomical. So that in the period 2015 to 2019, over 2,000 scholarly articles with the term gentrification in the title. Can somebody give me a glass of, Aaron, can you give me a glass of water? Yeah, thank you. So you have this explosion of research. If you read the scholarly literature, gentrification is one of the hottest topics among urban scholars today. There's huge literature about gentrification. There's also a huge popular discourse about gentrification. If you went out on the street and asked most people, have they heard of the term gentrification? I venture to say most average people would say, yeah, I've heard that term. You know, given the fact that it originated in a scholarly book, right, and is discussed by scholars. So what's happened in the public popular discourse? Gentrification has become disconnected from its roots in a specific neighborhood phenomenon, right? It's now gentrification. You can gentrify just about anything. If you read about this, it's kind of fun if you want to go online and explore this. As my friend Alan said again, you can gentrify, this is quoting Alan, social movements, chai, jobs, American healthcare, language, Mount Everest, and gefilte fish. He's found references to gentrification of gefilte fish, right? So you can gentrify just about anything. Well, what does it mean to gentrify something? Well, you can think about it yourself, right? It means basically that it's lost its edge, it's become absorbed by elitist consumer culture, it's catering to upper level tastes. It's similar to what we used to sometimes call bougie. We used to call things bougie, right? But now they're gentrified, right? So there's a real heated discourse on gentrification in the popular literature. It's a term of opprobrium. It's a term of criticism, right? No one ever, generally speaking, in the popular imagination, you don't say something got gentrified and mean that in a positive way. You mean it in a negative way. So the challenge for equity planners, I think, is pretty clear. This term, gentrification, is problematic, I think. We clearly need reinvestment and repopulation of older American cities like St. Louis and Cleveland. We need more people, we need more investment. On the other hand, if you revitalize a neighborhood, you can immediately turn around and say, you've succeeded, but you failed. You failed because you just drove up the housing prices, you're pushing people out of the neighborhood, and this is actually failure, right? So it violates, potentially, gentrification violates key equity planning principles, involuntary displacement of low-income people, that clearly violates equity, housing affordability, driving up housing affordability and draining people spending more than 30, 40, and 50% of their income on rent, that's clearly a problem. Loss of community control, people coming in and dominating your neighborhood and taking over and pushing you out, that's clearly a problem. So the gentrification, the G word as I call it, can polarize and often paralyze discussion, right? As soon as the word gets out there, you're in a situation often of zero sum. To quote Rick Jacobus, who writes often for Shelter Forest magazine, here's how he puts it. I share this in St. Louis. I work with community development groups all over the place, and I share this concern, right? The way most people talk about gentrification seems to create a black hole of self-doubt from which no realistic strategy for neighborhood improvement can escape. Gentrification seems to imply we are trapped. If we succeed, we fail, right? If we improve things and land values go up, we're nothing but draining the pockets of the low-income people who live there. I came up with a list here, and I bet you could come up with more, of things that I've seen attacked in the literature as precursors or stalking horses for gentrification, okay? Community gardens, transit-oriented development, green infrastructure, LEED certified buildings, hiking and biking paths, mixed income housing, and vegan restaurants. They're all problematic, right? Because we know what they're all about. They're just a strategy to gentrify the place, right? So the two sides talk past each other. It's very polarized. It's very emotional, right? And I think it's a problem for progressive planners when you've got this kind of discourse that automatically pushes people into two sides. So my goal is to somehow create a dialogue here. Well, you tell me if I succeed, right? Create a dialogue between the critics and the supporters of these kinds of processes that we call gentrification. So my approach is putting gentrification in its place. So how do equity planners work toward urban revival while respecting the concerns of the critics of gentrification? They're legitimate concerns about housing affordability, displacement, community control. Obviously, these are legitimate. Well, my general answer is to move away from a overgeneralized, abstract way of thinking about the process that the word connotes and recognize the importance of particular historical and geographical contexts. Gentrification varies. It's not some unitary, holistic phenomenon where everything's wrapped up into one package automatically. That's an empirical question as to how it actually works out. So if I was a linguistic dictator for a day, by the way, I would just eliminate the word. You can't use the word anymore. I would say, get rid of that word gentrification. I think it's become so meaningless and so generalized, right, and so kind of fraught that I'd just soon get it out of the language. But of course, that horse has left the barn, right? I ain't gonna do it. So the question is, what do we do then? By the way, Eskimos have 50 plus names for snow, but we only have one name for neighborhoods that are socioeconomically ascending. Gentrification, right? We've got to have more nuance than that. We've got to be more sophisticated, right? So the traditional concept wraps many different contingent phenomena that could vary from one context or time. They wrap it all into one concept, right? Into one deterministic, holistic process. The movement of higher income households into older urban neighborhoods, the automatic displacement, physical, cultural, social, and political, and a process that occurs with rapidity. It's fast. You remember in the Glass definition, she says that. She says it happens fast. All those things, the speed, the displacement, the cultural effects, all those things, I want to say, well, let's study and see what actually happened, right? And not assume that in every case they're wrapped up with gentrification. When I use the term gentrification, and this is really important, when I use the term gentrification, if I had go, I want to put, like air quotes around it, right? Okay? And what I mean, when I use the term gentrification in the rest of this talk, what I mean is the movement of higher income households into older, lower income neighborhoods. That's what I mean. Now, whether that leads to displacement, cultural domination, loss of political power, all those other things, that's separate, right? Of course, it could be the case it does, right? But when I use the term gentrification, I'm going to say the core idea of gentrification is this idea of higher income, often higher educated households moving into lower income, older urban neighborhoods. The first point I want to make, historical context matters. Okay, this talk is an intelligence test, okay? We're going to test your intelligence. You all know this quote, right? F. Scott Fitzgerald, the sign of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in the mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. Okay, ready for this? It may sound easy, but it's not. It's like rubbing your head and patting your stomach at the same time. It's very difficult to do. I'm serious. Intellectually, it's challenging. It's not just like, well, there's this and there's this. It's actually difficult to do. So we are in an age, in short, of simultaneous de-urbanization and re-urbanization, of vacancy and abandonment and gentrification and revival, okay? We are in a simultaneous age, so there it is, folks. It's both happening at once, right? They're going in two directions. I have one arrow a little bigger than the other for a reason, but for the moment. And here's the important point. These different historical periods are layered on top of each other. The older period of the urban crisis that we talked about before, what it was like in 1979, that's still going on, folks. It's still there. That was a traumatic period. People's racial opinions have been influenced by that period, that traumatic period. Whites and blacks, right? It was a perfect storm of race relations where you had African Americans moving into American cities to take industrial jobs. As soon as they get there, they have the rug pulled out from underneath. You get deindustrialization. Right after that, we pass the civil rights laws, which enables them to move into neighborhoods, right? And then we do urban renewal and push people out of their homes. wow, talk about creating rancorous race relations, that's a perfect storm. And we still live with the aftermath of that. That has influenced people's race perceptions, their perceptions of neighborhoods, right? That period, which was a one particular historical period, a constellation of forces, right, that created very, very problematic race relations at that time. So we have to take this into account. The strength of the forces varies clearly. As I pointed out, New York City is clearly, the arrow in New York City going in is much stronger, right, compared to the arrow going out, relatively speaking. Here in Cleveland and St. Louis, the arrow going out is probably bigger than the arrow going in, right? In fact, I think it's significantly bigger. I'll get to that in a second. So gentrification displacement pressures are, the first point I want to make is, in older industrial cities like St. Louis and Cleveland, gentrification displacement pressures are surprisingly low. This is where I get into controversial remarks, but I'll prepare your criticisms, right, so we can continue the conversation at the end. So I studied 4 gentrifying neighborhoods in St. Louis. And basically, I chose these neighborhoods because they've had extraordinary increases in young, educated people with BAs or more, right? We're talking, huge increases in these neighborhoods in St. Louis. You've got some of them here, I'm sure, in Cleveland as well. Young millennials, college degrees, right? They're moving to these neighborhoods. That's where they like to live. These are 4 neighborhoods in St. Louis. Home values are up significantly. You can see the column of median home value, the increase in median home value, much bigger than the citywide average, right? In each case. So in each case, home values have been going up significantly. And of course, if you are a lower moderate income person, you owned a home, that means your taxes are going up. To me, it's not nearly as problematic, because you can obviously make money by selling your home, right? So I realize you might be forced to move, but you're going to make some money. I don't know, it's complicated, right? But with regard to, I think that the home increase in home values is not so problem. What we're really interested in is increase in rents. What's happening to increase in rents? It turns out that there is an affordability crisis in St. Louis, and I'm sure there's an affordability crisis in Cleveland, right? The median renter in St. Louis pays over 30% of their income on rent. So that means that half the people are rent burdened, okay, are paying more than 30%. Probably doesn't surprise you, right? So we got an affordability problem. But the question is, to what extent is gentrification the cause of the affordability problem, right? That's the question. Rents are going up in gentrified neighborhoods. You can see it here. The median rent change, it's going up. But the first thing I want to point out, and you can look at the numbers, is tremendous variability here. I chose these neighborhoods because they're, in my term, gentrification, right? Basic growth in this educated, younger, higher income households, right? But you can see tremendous variety. In some cases, in one case, rents went up less than the citywide average. So what you need to do is take out the citywide average and then ask, how much has it gone up, right? And the citywide average is pretty big, by the way. It turns out, oddly enough, in some of the most depressed neighborhoods in St. Louis, rents are going up. And we can talk about that if you want to after the break. It doesn't seem to make sense, right? Why are they going up in these neighborhoods with very, very low incomes? But anyway, that's happening across the city. And yet, in the gentrified neighborhoods, clearly some of them are seeing huge. This one saw a huge increase, but notice those are new units. That's what's called new build gentrification, right? They didn't displace directly people who were living in existing rental housing. They built more rental housing units. Does everybody follow that? So, what do you say about that? Well, I don't know. It's not good. Maybe rents are high, but people, it's satisfying a certain segment of the market. There are other neighborhoods here which do have significant increases in rent, and that could be a concern, right? Once again, you should subtract the citywide increase, because we're talking about the phenomenon at the neighborhood level, right? Gentrification ultimately is a neighborhood phenomenon. It turns out that if you look at Shaw, which is one of the most, right here, which saw a significant increase. This is, by the way, controlling for inflation over a 17-year period. So I wouldn't call these rent increases, really astronomical, but anyway, they're there, right? It turns out that the median rental unit in Shaw is affordable to somebody making about 50% of the median income for the metropolitan area. So even though rents have gone up, the rents are still pretty affordable. They're affordable for people making 50%. That's called low income, isn't it, in the federal guidelines? The other thing that's going on here with regard to affordability is, which I want to point out, is that gentrification is occurring in neighborhoods that are already pretty strong. It's not occurring in St. Louis in the most depressed, high vacancy neighborhoods, which is what rent gap theory said, and that what is implied in the concept of gentrification, right? That it goes into those neighborhoods that are really, really disinvested and jumps in when there's a rent gap. And no, gentrification actually goes into the areas. So the gentrification vector is not aimed at black communities. It's aimed in cities across the country, not just St. Louis, by the way. It's aimed at communities that are located in parts of the city that are often actually fairly racially diverse and whose urban fabric is intact, right? It doesn't target. There is, in a study we did of gentrification in St. Louis, we found that not a single census tract that was majority black in 1970, got to think about this, that was surrounded by other majority black census tracts gentrified or rebounded, as we said, right? Not a single one. There is not a single neighborhood north of Del Mar that has experienced gentrification. It is a gentrification-free zone. So the notion, which I think is implicit in the literature, that gentrification targets the most vulnerable, the African-American communities, right, the most vacant communities, is simply not empirically true. It tends to go to areas that are already fairly intact, and I could go into more detail, are already fairly diverse. So the main cause of housing unaffordability, is, by the way, renters' incomes in the city of St. Louis, 2000 to 2017, controlling for inflation, went down 8%. Renters' incomes are going down. Rents are going up, right, across the board. Those two things by themselves is enough to create an affordability problem. So the main cause of housing affordability is not rising rents in gentrified neighborhoods. It's poverty, as Chris was saying, right? It's the fact that people don't have enough. 46%, according to my data, 46% of Cleveland households earn less than $25,000 a year, according to recent ACS data. That means that they can afford a total of $625 a month for an apartment, plus heating, plus electricity, right? Do the numbers sometimes, and try to manage an apartment building with rents that low. You'll find out how difficult it is, right? So the main problem of affordability is not inadequate supply of affordable housing, it's inadequate demand or income to buy good housing, right? So the displacement, so the displacement related to disinvestment. So if you want to see what is the main cause of involuntary displacement, there are many households that are forced to move. There's tremendous churning in low-income communities. For the most part, it occurs not in gentrified neighborhoods, which are actually relatively stable. It occurs in neighborhoods that are experiencing rapid growth in poverty and vacancy and abandonment. That's where you get this involuntary displacement, the churning. As Tom Byers pointed out again, we're still overproducing housing, right? In the Cleveland area, we're producing more units of housing than there are new households in the region, which means we automatically have vacancy and abandonment, usually in the older parts. So that old urban crisis is still going on, right? Under the radar, it's still pushing along. We're still overproducing housing on the suburban periphery, which leads automatically to abandonment at the center. Gentrification forces in St. Louis, Cleveland are leaking to the suburbs. According to my data, 24% of city jobs that are located in the city of Cleveland are held by residents of Cleveland. That means 76% leak out to the suburbs, right? In the case of St. Louis, only 24% of the jobs in the central corridor, which is our area of tech employment, right, are held by city residents. So we're leaking out most of the gentrification phenomena out to the suburbs, right? I wish more of those folks would come and live in the city, right? So we really have a problem. Neighborhood decline and concentrated poverty are much more the problem than is gentrification. So, and here's my factoid for St. Louis based upon an article I wrote. This is for the period 1970 to 2010, 17 times as many people live in neighborhoods that went from low poverty to high poverty as live in neighborhoods that went from high poverty to low poverty. The latter is what we kind of think of gentrification, right? This poverty neighborhood being invaded by high-income people and taking it over and becoming low poverty, a gentrified neighborhood. 17 times as many people live in neighborhoods that are experiencing downward motion, right? Weak markets lead to evictions. Here's a map that my friend Austin Harrison, a student at Georgia State, did. This is using the eviction lab data that Matt Desmond has begun to collect around the country. And this is market strength. The areas in the kind of orange, I'm not too good with colors, are bottom of the market. The areas in green are top of the market. It was a series of indices, not just one thing. It was a series of things, right, that Austin created an index of market strength. And what you see here is that most evictions, legal evictions, took place in weak market areas. If you look at the areas where you get more of the gentrification, you tend to have fewer evictions than the areas that are experiencing weak market conditions. So weak markets are really what is causing a lot of the problems. Weak markets, in my view, are the scourge of low-income neighborhoods. They strip wealth out of households. African Americans, again and again and again, have bought into neighborhoods and found that the demand has been taken out from underneath them and their house doesn't appreciate. And because of historical reasons, they were not allowed to buy into areas of the region that have experienced large house appreciation. As a result, African American household wealth is about 7% of white household wealth, primarily due to housing, even though their income data is about 70%. That's mostly a housing phenomenon, right? So weak markets are a scourge for low-income people, low-income neighborhoods, and they also, in my opinion, reduce the opportunity space for equity planners. If you want to try to do something, when you go into an extremely weak neighborhood, your alternatives are limited, right? You've got to really figure out what to do. So what are some equity policies? Well, probably a lot of you can imagine what these could be, but here's what I'm going to say. We need to have policies that preserve affordable housing in neighborhoods that are gentrifying. Of course we do, but do not slow down the process of gentrification. It's that latter that a lot of people are not going to like, right? We don't want it to slow down the engine that's creating this reinvestment in the city. So we should target subsidized housing in gentrifying areas, high opportunity areas. We ought to be concentrating when we have subsidies for affordable housing. Let's put them in those gentrifying neighborhoods. Let's put them in those places with high opportunity, with growing retail sector, with a growing middle class, by the way, that can defend the neighborhood politically and all sorts of other things. Too often we build housing in weak market areas, and we do that. What we do is we just increase the supply when there's already an oversupply, and probably what we do is we just create a vacancy 6-8 blocks down the way, right? Build a nice new housing in a weak market area, a hyper vacant area, you're just going to lead to more vacancies, right? So we often make the mistake that way. The second thing I want to make is capture the unearned increment. Some of you are familiar with Henry George, who wrote about the unearned increment. The unearned increment is the rise in property values due not to the labor of the person who owns the property, but due to society more generally, right? Or to market dynamics, right? It's unearned because, you know, if you fix up your home and put a new kitchen in, of course you should sell your house for more. That's earned, right? But if the land under your house goes up in value because you just sat there, that's unearned, right? And that's where the real money is. The real money is in the inflation in land values. You're not going to make a lot of money fixing up your kitchen, right? But you can make a lot of money by having a house sitting on a piece of property that goes up and up and up. So I basically support the idea of single taxation, but, you know, put a tax on land, right? And encourage people to improve their properties. But the additional revenue from gentrification can obviously be taxed, right? To provide schools, to provide more funding for police, for public safety, for community policing, for parks. We've gone through a period of urban austerity in the United States for 30 or 40 years now, with federal funding for the cities going down precipitously. The Community Development Block Grant, which is the main successor to the war on poverty, is down 80% after controlling for inflation. So federal support for cities has dropped to almost nothing. And cities are going through a period of austerity. Just drive around older American cities, right? Drive around some European cities sometimes, see what they look like. Go around some German cities. I was just there. Did a partnership with Dortmund. It looks a lot better, folks. The infrastructure is a lot better. The public transit is fantastic. We need to invest in our cities. We need a massive program investment. Absent that, what can we do as equity planners? Well, get some investment in the city and tax it, right? And use that for progressive purposes. Tax increment financing, TIF. Tax the increment, right? This is a TIF. Those are TIFs which are often used to build parking garages at retail malls in the suburbs or something like that. Why not use a TIF for affordable housing? If you have a gentrified neighborhood, land values are going up, capture that increase in land value in the TIF and use the monies for affordable housing in that neighborhood, right? Because then you're putting housing where people have opportunity and greater safety and an uplifting neighborhood. So the nice thing about TIFs is that unlike inclusionary zoning, which I generally like, but inclusionary zoning is going to chill the market a little bit, right? It's going to say to the developer, TIF, the developer doesn't even notice it. The developer's going to pay the same taxes they've always paid, right? Just so happens the money's going to go for affordable housing, right? So it offers some real advantages to that. And the other thing I would, idea we've talked about in St. Louis is have elongated TIF districts. TIF districts that extend out from gentrifying areas out into the weak market areas, right? Where there are amenities and assets. And then use those funds from the rising land values in the gentrifying areas to fund infrastructure to jumpstart the market. And as much as possible, equity planners want to spread the demand, spread the housing demand out of these hot market areas into the neighboring areas as much as possible, right? Because there is a problem with overheated housing markets. If they get too overheated, they clearly are a problem. And have a middle market strategy. We need some way I gotta wrap up pretty quickly here. We need some way to deal with neighborhoods that are threatened by urban decline. More neighborhoods are threatened by urban decline than are threatened by gentrification. We need a program to take those middle neighborhoods, those ones that are on the edge, right, and make sure they don't fall down. And many of those are African-American neighborhoods, by the way. It'd be very important. A huge problem in the current city, we were talking about this before my talk, Norm and I, black flight is a huge problem in cities now. The black middle class is moving to the suburbs, and we have black flight to the suburbs, and we have this white movement into cities, right? So we're getting a very different set of dynamics. We need to do something about that. And there's a national middle neighborhoods movement. They've met here in Cleveland, and I've been part of it. It's something we should be thinking about. So finally, I want to talk about this symbolic dimension of this problem. Now we're going to talk about imagery, not about substance, right? We're going to talk about how people perceive things and what I call gentrification anxiety. As you'll notice so far in the talk, I've generally downplayed fears about displacement from gentrification in cities like St. Louis and Cleveland. I think, by the way, even in hot market cities, big questions can be raised about those fears, but that's another question. But one thing the critics of gentrification are right about is that people feel displaced in the modern city, right? They feel it. They are angry, folks. They do not like the way things are going. Their fears, and these fears and anxieties that people have are facts. They're facts just as much as the fact that the median rent is $625 or whatever it is, right? It's just as much a fact the way people feel about something, right? And equity planners need to deal with those facts. They need to deal with how people feel about something, irregardless of what's happening on the ground, right? I mean, they're facts. It doesn't matter what Professor Swanstrom tells them. Well, that's not really gentrification. Forget it. They don't care. They can give a SH about that, right? They feel that something's going on here. So in St. Louis, concerned about this issue that people are crying gentrification and displacement when we really felt that there really wasn't, a dominant gentrification going on in many of these neighborhoods, we said, well, you got to talk to people. What's going on here, right? So we did a series of focus groups. The methodology of a focus group is very simple. You get people together in a room, a small group, and you, in a very neutral fashion, ask them to talk about a subject, and you record that conversation, and you glean the themes that come out of that conversation, right? And our first question to them was, and I facilitated one of these focus groups, right? 8 out of 9 of the members of the focus group were African Americans living in the north side or the near north side of St. Louis. When you hear the word gentrification, what words come to mind? And there were 68 words that came up, and it doesn't probably surprise you to learn that by a greater than 2-to-1 ratio, we judge the terms to be negative, right? Terms like loss, forced out, priced out, those are all negative things, right? There were some positive things, but for most part, the language was highly negative. And basically, when we analyzed the conversation, and by the way, in the focus group that I facilitated, I just started the conversation, and they just took off. I mean, they were emotional. They were, damn it, whites move in, and all of a sudden the cops show up. They didn't show up before. Now they show up. What the hell's going on, right? And they just took off, and it went on and on and on. So what happens in the language of gentrification, you get, and here are some quotes. Gentrification is viewed as a conflictual process, not surprisingly, I think, right, given the way the term is understood. These are some quotes from the focus group. Politicians act more attentive to the new gentrified class in order to please and be reelected. By the way, there's undoubtedly some truth to this, right? You got people moving to the neighborhood, have more connections, more money. I think the politicians might pay more attention to them, and other things being equal, right? So it's not coming out of thin air, right? Newcomers have things that old-timers don't have. The residents do not integrate. Gentrification hurts disparities, no matter what race. And then they also, which was very interesting, because you notice I said that this connection between gentrification and decline, or the most disinvested neighborhoods, empirically does not hold. Gentrification actually is targeted at relatively stable neighborhoods in the middle, often racially diverse, right? But they clearly felt that gentrification was closely related to decline. In fact, they couldn't talk about gentrification without talking about disinvestment and decline, okay? In their minds, this was the connection. Gentrification takes resources from other places. In some ways, corporate takeover under gentrification can cause deterioration. So they viewed the disinvestment in the north side and gentrification on the south side of Cleveland as being intimately connected, okay? There's no doubt they viewed it that way. So as I said, these are facts, right? We got to deal with it. If we're planners, we got to deal with the way people really feel about what's going on, regardless of its relationship with any theory or empirical facts about gentrification. Clearly, I would argue, how do I interpret this? I think, a number of us have talked about this for a long time, gentrification expresses people's fears about widening inequality in the modern American city, about cultural and political marginalization by low-income minorities and immigrants, and a sense of powerlessness. It's expressing these feelings, right? They feel powerless, they feel marginalized, they feel displaced, right? And they're expressing it through this term gentrification. It's based in part on a memory of urban renewal. Remember I told you these two forces are going on and they're layered? That memory of urban renewal in the black community, highway building and urban renewal displaced tens of thousands of people in St. Louis. There's no doubt that in the black community, this idea that, the government comes in, it identifies a place, it kicks us out, and it takes it over. I can understand where that came from. It didn't come from out of thin air, right? It came from real experience that's historical. It's layered in, it's baked into the way people feel, right? Even though things have changed since then, that process is still going on. Gentrification offers a straightforward narrative of greedy developers in bed with politicians. When you think about vacancy and abandonment, right? What causes vacancy and abandonment? It's a more anonymous process. I mean, people are moving away. I mean, who are we going to? Can you get angry at somebody because they move away, right? I don't know. We can talk about that. Actually, I think there is a serious problem there. But it's much easier to identify a villain, right? To identify an agent when you talk about gentrification. When you talk about vacancy and abandonment, much more different. So how do equity planners deal with the subjective experience of gentrification? There's a group called the Frameworks Institute. Is anybody familiar with the Frameworks Institute? Anybody worked with them? Okay, I think they're fantastic, by the way. They do incredible work. Their methodology, they did a research on people's perceptions and language with regard to issues like gentrification. And the way they did the research, had 6,000 surveys, and the way they do it is they give a verbal prompt. They'll say something about gentrification, right? And then they'll ask them questions like, does place where people live affect their ability to get ahead, or is it mostly a matter of personal, or is it entirely a matter of personal responsibility, right? I wrote a book called Place Matters, so you know where I stand on that. Should we open up the suburbs for affordable housing? Should mixed income communities be promoted by government policy? So it gives a verbal prompt, with something like the term gentrification, then ask them, what do you think about these other issues, right? And tries to determine, is the verbal prompt, does it influence the way people think? Subsequently, it turns out it has a significant impact, right? Should we address, so the question that I had after doing all this thinking is, when we work in St. Louis, my attitude was, let's not even use the word gentrification. Let's just start talking about progressive urban policy and how we can plan healthy, mixed income, mixed use communities, right? Let's get away from that word, because that word, I've told you why I don't like the word, right? But it's clear what they said. They said they did the research, they found out that acknowledging people's fears about gentrification leads to more, use the word progressive views about mixed income, planned, equitable communities, right? I won't go into this because I'm running against the end of but here you can say the blue line is explaining well-planned socioeconomic mixing without acknowledging concerns about gentrification, right? And the green is acknowledging and countering the concerns. In other words, what they said was, talk about gentrification, acknowledge people's fears and anxieties, and then pivot pretty quickly to how can we build planned communities that are mixed income, mixed use, and facilitate a strong community, right? And what they found out is that it's better to acknowledge it, right? To acknowledge those fears. But once again, they were clear, don't dwell on it. Don't dwell on that gentrification because that gets people thinking in this polarized kind of discourse, but acknowledge that these fears are real and then pivot quickly to the public policies that can make a difference. So very quickly, a few concluding remarks so we can get to the panel of respondents. Don't get hung up on gentrification, folks. Get rid of your hang-ups. Move into older urban neighborhoods, fix up the housing, don't feel guilty, and then get involved. Get involved in promoting policies to make sure there's affordable housing for the people who have lived there, right? You have nothing to feel guilty about. Neighborhoods change all the time. That's what cities are. Support equitable development. Gentrification is not inevitable. There are real examples of neighborhoods. I showed you one, by the way, that I think is a successful mixed income, mixed race community in St. Louis, right? The CDC has developed 242 units of affordable housing. It's perpetually affordable housing, a neighborhood that's really going up. The racial balance has been stable for many years. There's stable neighborhood gentrification, stable integrated neighborhoods are possible. Strong markets can be leveraged for greater equity. We need strong markets, and if we have the political will, we can leverage that market strength for the benefit of all, and be aware of the power of language. Avoid abstract thinking. That kind of abstract thinking, which the term gentrification embodies for me. Acknowledge fears, pivot quickly to concrete ways to build vibrant, mixed income, mixed use, diverse communities. Thank you very much for your indulgence. I went over. Chris.
Yeah, I'm okay.
Hi, Norm.
Hi.
Well, first of all, I would really like to give a round of applause to Todd for this wonderful lecture that we just had the opportunity to experience. An additional round of applause for Norm for his leadership and legacy that he's had in Cleveland all these years. Thank you. Thank you. My name is Keisha Gonzalez. I am the Program Officer for Neighborhood Revitalization and Engagement at the Cleveland Foundation. Additionally, I am a rogue historic preservationist and a recovering CDC director. So a lot of the comments that you shared with us today, Todd, were very relevant and timely. So I think for our Q&A structure, I want to toss out two formatted questions, and then I really want to take an opportunity to do Q&A from students and those who are here for APA, because I think it's just a really, really timely opportunity to ask these questions. So kind of reflecting on the migration patterns that we experience, in particular here in the Cleveland context over the past 50 years, did you ever think that there would be such a seismic shift into what I would, at least in my observation, consider to be Eurocentric socioeconomic settlement patterns, right, where we're having wealthier folks living in urban cores? And what do we have to be aware of and conscious of as our middle class is shrinking, especially in particular my interest, the Cleveland context?
Well, if I'm thinking back 40 years to my experience as city planning director in Cleveland, a lot of these issues were not on our minds at all. A lot of them never came up. There was no gentrification, for example. Gentrification was something we ardently desired, but had no control over, as Todd mentioned, in terms of putting a statistical framework around what was going on. During the decade of the 70s, we lost about 170,000 people. And when you lose 170,000 people, you don't think about what's incoming, because in fact nothing was incoming. You think about what you have in place and how best to hold it in place. And so our focus was on stabilization and trying to better the low-income populations that existed in Cleveland without concerning ourselves with too many other extraneous kinds of issues. To amplify on that point and compare it with contemporary planning issues, we didn't think very, very much about global change, for example. We didn't think about a lot of the issues which are front and center in terms of planning today, including gentrification. As I said, we were just trying to hold on to the existing situation and make life for the existing lower income populations more tolerable.
Okay. Yeah, it's a good question, and you know, it's the long-standing, as you alluded, the long-standing pattern in European and South American cities is for the affluent to live in the center, and the lower-income people to be pushed to the periphery, right? And Marian's from Paris; she knows what the pattern is in Paris, right? It is somewhat surprising to see a shift. I mean, one thing that's clearly going to happen in the years ahead is global warming in the environment. There's no doubt that compact cities consume less energy, emit less carbon, and are going to have to be part of the solution. So I see that as really significant in the long run. We've had this artificially low gas price that, you know, really the gas prices are about as low if you control for inflation as they've ever been. And so we really haven't faced up to that dynamic. The other thing I just want to say quickly is that I think what's happened, you know, I'm not a real aficionado of Richard Florida, but I do think there is something to the idea that the innovation economy desires an urban setting that's edgy, that's interesting, that has this ambiance and has a certain buzz. People who work in creative, I don't like the word creative because a lot of people are creative who don't get put in that class, but people who work in innovation, let's say, do desire to live in cities. So I think having a high quality city, you know, with good parks, good infrastructure, good transit, that having a quality of life that's high does help you to develop your economy. So the supply of labor does, to a certain extent, create a demand for labor, even though it's mostly driven by demand, right? People move to cities to get a job. But I think, you know, if you can have a high-quality city with high-quality amenities, you're going to be ahead of the game in the growth as the years come ahead. And part of that is, you know, downtown has become a neighborhood. Downtown wasn't a neighborhood so much when we in the 70s, right? It's become a neighborhood. By that I mean a lot of people want to live downtown.
Awesome. So what do you see the role of planning, and in particular the principles of equity planning, as it relates to Cleveland's development pace today? And in particular, in its role that it has to play in neighborhoods such as Glenville and Clark Fulton, which, you know, every so often we hear are called these edge neighborhoods that are suffering from the development pressures of their neighboring neighborhoods.
I'm sorry, I didn't get the question.
So what do you see as the role of planning?
Equity planning.
Yeah.
As it relates to the pace of development in Cleveland, and in particular, how it impacts areas like Clark Fulton and Glenville?
Okay, I think I've got that. Let me back up a little bit and sort of give you my own version in a larger context of what's going on in Cleveland over the last 5 or 10 years and what the planners ought to be addressing very, very particularly. Much of this is probably familiar to all the planners in the audience. We have now about 6 or 7, maybe 1 or 2 more or less neighborhoods which are coming back or can be described as have come back, that are doing well, that are attracting people, particularly the young, educated incomers that we want into those neighborhoods. And we can all identify those neighborhoods pretty well. On the west side, for example, Detroit Shoreway, Tremont, Ohio City. On the east side, University Circle, Little Italy, and so on. So those cities, those neighborhoods are doing quite well. And there are a couple of other neighborhoods in addition that are going ahead. And in those neighborhoods, there is something that conceivably could be called gentrification, using the definitions that Todd gave us. Then there's a larger body of neighborhoods in the city over the last 10 years, which appears to be not doing well and not falling behind, sort of floating on the line. And the majority of neighborhoods in the city, I think, fall into that category. And then there are neighborhoods in the city which are falling behind, sharply falling behind. And those neighborhoods are largely occupied by low-income families, heavily African American in Cleveland, where the middle class, the relative middle class, is moving out. Now these are people that I'm talking about who are earning perhaps a total of $70,000 or $80,000 a year as a family, man, wife, modest jobs, civil service jobs, postman, that sort of thing, earning a fair amount of income, enough income, if they have a good credit rating, to get a FHA-insured mortgage and be able to buy a house in the suburbs. And those people are the people who are going into Garfield Heights and Maple Heights and Bedford Heights and those communities mostly on the east side, and abandoning the residents in the neighborhoods that they've occupied so long. Left behind are families of very, very low income. With the best wishes in the world, there is not enough resource left in those neighborhoods to reconstruct or redevelop those neighborhoods or rebuild them in any way. And that, it seems to me, is the larger question that confronts planning and public administration and politics and a lot of other interrelated issues in the city of Cleveland. Who and how are those neighborhoods going to be rebuilt? Where are the resources going to come from to rebuild those neighborhoods? Where will the ideas come from that develop in those neighborhoods new environments entirely that are integrated both racially and financially and successfully for the city of Cleveland in the future? And I don't see the answer to that as yet on the horizon. But that, it seems to me, is a major, major problem for planners and other people in City Hall and related to the whole development industry to address. And I'd be curious to see what Todd's reaction to that graphic picture is.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head, one of the concerns I have. And certainly, one of the pieces of a solution has to be connecting the residents of the neighborhoods in the city to the new economy, the innovation economy that's growing up. So workforce development has to be part of the solution. And it's been very challenging. The decay of the middle class, the disconnection between the failure of educational systems. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done on workforce development, connecting people to the new economy. It doesn't mean that everybody's going to be a computer programmer. It means there's lots of jobs that spin off of this new economy, the eds and meds, you know. How can we leverage that? What is it, the Evergreen Cooperative here that, you know, the workers own their own laundry here and do laundry for the Cleveland Clinic. There's one way to get some of that wealth into the neighborhoods, right? But it's a serious, serious issue. And, you know, one thing that I am very concerned about is the kind of resources for planning, the kind of institutional strength, the kind of institutional robustness that planning requires in order to get it done. And, you know, in the city of St. Louis, our city planning department, the city of St. Louis has, you know, 3 or 4 full-time planners, you know, for a major American city. Yeah, funded. There's other staff people, but in terms of, and if you go out to the suburbs, I'm even more concerned, right, because you have these small suburbs, And in an area called 2401, where there are 24 suburbs in one school district, there are 0 planners, not a single city planner. So how do you do equity planning when there's no institution?
Well, how do you do planning of any kind?
Of any kind, exactly. So I'm concerned about institutional strength, and and I am concerned, and I have a piece in Kathy Hexter's and Norm's book on making equity planning work, Equity Planning Now, on the suburbanization, and I am concerned that the environment in suburbs is not as friendly to low-income people as the environment in cities. I know that cuts against a lot of our views because central cities have been viewed as a real collection of poverty, right? But urbanism, which values public goods, in which you have a kind of a long history of community organizing back to the 1670s, a wealth of nonprofits and other institutions, community development corporations. When you go to the suburbs, you have just the opposite. You have a lifestyle that's based on privatism, an emphasis on private provision, whether it's transportation, recreation, or whatever, and you have a weaker institutional environment. So once again, the institutional question is right at the fore. How do you create strong institutions through which good policies can be planned and implemented?
So my final question before I open up for Q&A to the crowd is, you mentioned focusing and concentrating investments and subsidies for affordability in neighborhoods that are doing well or picking up in that middle realm. I guess the question, to keep it completely open-ended, then what do we do in divested neighborhoods? What do we do to help in meeting that goal that Norm worked to and stabilizing them? The windows are narrowing in values. What's the plan? What do we do? What's the advice?
Well, it doesn't seem to me to be illogical to focus a great deal of public resources on neighborhoods that are doing well. Neighborhoods that are doing well usually are creating their own development, their own success in many significant ways. The greater focus for most public subsidies, it seems to me, should be on middle-class neighborhoods that have a chance to go forward, but there should be a big residue of public subsidy to sustain those lower income neighborhoods as well, which means more resources. In general, that's a fundamental challenge, I think, that faces not only planning, but obviously government as well, an inadequacy of resources. And as Todd and others have pointed out, the federal government is the source or the potential source of most of those resources, and it's been cutting back and avoiding its responsibility for its older urban neighborhoods.
Well, I agree with everything Norm said, and it's a great question. What do you do in neighborhoods that are disinvested, have high rates of vacancy, and very weak markets? What do you do? And as I said, the opportunity space is limited for equity planners because you have a weak market. It's hard to leverage the market. What you need to do is you clearly do not abandon them because people are going to live there. People are living in these neighborhoods that have high rates of vacancy and abandonment, and it would be immoral and wrong, frankly, to simply abandon them. You invest in quality of life, try to improve the quality of life. If there are vacant homes being used as drug houses, you tear them down, you create community gardens, you try to make it a more attractive environment. But what you need to do is, you shouldn't be investing development dollars in these neighborhoods. You shouldn't be investing, as I said, don't build new housing. You need to build the market for housing. You need to build the market before you build housing. So what does it mean to build the market? That means you got to have a number of things in place, right? You got to have relatively low levels of crime, a sense of safety. You've got to have public amenities like parks. You've got to have decent schools if you want families to live in there. So you've got a real challenge to build that up. It strikes me that in the areas of St. Louis and Cleveland where groups are doing this work, you have to concentrate your resources on nodes where you have a chance to create areas that will have some sort of sustainability, right? You can't spread it around like peanut butter. The peanut butter approach doesn't work in North St. Louis, I can guarantee you, and we've done a lot of that, by the way. Build a few houses there, build a few there. It just doesn't work. You need to have a plan that focuses on potential amenities that can
Well,
actually be leveraged.
I think what you're saying is sort of a version of what I was saying a little earlier, which is to say, if you've got an environment that is classified into three locations, one doing relatively well, or rather well, the other sort of floating on the line but offering promise for success, the third very, very low and low income, disorganized, no environmental infrastructure at all, you've got to focus your development dollars on that middle category, but focus your social welfare dollars on the lower category, so that element, and tend to disregard, to the extent that you're politically able to do that, disregard the upper income classification entirely.
So, well, thank you, gentlemen, for your thought leadership and these questions, and I'd like to open up for Q&A with the crowd.
We've answered all the questions. I take it.
Good afternoon. I came late. I'm so sorry I missed a lot of it. But I want to address a couple of things that you talked about. First of all, Glenville Circle. There's two projects that are going on. One in Glenville Circle, one at Woodhill Homes called Purpose-Built Communities. There's work being done with CMHA property. There are people in place. I sit on every board that's affiliated with this. This is low-income housing, okay? First of all, to rebuild anything, you have to start with rebuilding the spirit of the people who live there, okay? In order to start restructuring anything. When people's spirits are broken and it's so much diverse, it's so much disconnect, there's so much systematic things that have been done over the years as far as low-income housing is concerned. People are detached, people are desperate, people are in despair. So we have to stop referring to it like we're a piece of garbage that's thrown away in our neighborhoods. We have to start building. There is plans in process right now for Woodhill Homes. I just left City Architect yesterday. The first part of the draft was accepted. That's only a scratch of the surface of the work that has to be done in the area. But we have to start somewhere. We're trying to build new homes as far as public housing is concerned. We're trying to give people a fair shake, the ones that live in public housing, the opportunity to come out of public housing and buy their first homes. So it's a lot of things that has to be in place. There are a lot of things to try to rebuild our communities, to have people stay in the community where they work, live, and play. So we have to start with the spirit before we start tearing down anything. Yes, people are moving to the suburbs, but we want to keep them in the neighborhoods where they grew up at. So let me just say that first of all, okay?
Thank you, Ms. Marilyn.
Is there a question there?
Oh, the question is, so how do you think that the structure should start? Instead of tearing it down, let's start bringing, all these programs are great, but we talk about bringing it to these low-income communities, as you say. But first of all, where would you start as far as rebuilding the spirit of the people that already live there?
Well, I'll just take a quick crack at this, Norm. Thank you, ma'am. Those are great comments. If you study the literature on neighborhood change and what happens to neighborhoods, it turns out that people's perceptions are powerful. Now, obviously, they interact with objective conditions on the ground, but the most important element in the future of a neighborhood is the confidence of the people who live there in the neighborhood. If they think the neighborhood's going to go down, remember I talked about the self-fulfilling prophecy of the Chicago school? If you say there's a neighborhood life cycle in older urban neighborhoods that are racially integrated are automatically going to fail, they're going to fail, folks. But if you believe that they can succeed, that's a crucial element. Now, obviously, you need to also put in place something that builds on that confidence, right? So you've got to have real improvements. But you've hit the nail on the head. There's nothing more important than confidence in a neighborhood. And it turns out, of course, it's influenced by race, it's influenced by class, it's influenced by the media, the way the media covers neighborhoods, the way the media covers cities. If it bleeds, it leads. All you hear about is murder and mayhem. In St. Louis, we've had a number of murders that are on the front page every day, and that's making it very difficult to do work in some of these neighborhoods. So, you know, you've got to shape the perceptions and think about language, think about the way we talk about our neighborhoods, right? And I think that's very, very important. And, you know, we want self-fulfilling prophecies, right, in the right direction.
I would just echo those remarks. Obviously, there's a certain amount of community organizing that's important in some of these neighborhoods, and a certain amount of meeting together, talking together, developing a series of conversations around shared values and goals and objectives. But, you know, the final support for community enthusiasm is a tangible physical project, a park, a meeting house of some sort, a police substation, something like that, which is a tangible demonstration of government toward the neighborhood. And in order to do that, of course, you have to mobilize funds, and that's the big question in cities like Cleveland, or a big question in cities like Cleveland.
Thank you so much for this this presentation. It's been so interesting. I've had for 30 years, I've had people ask me, "How's your neighborhood doing? Is it coming back? Is it, you know, revitalizing? How's Cleveland doing? Are you back yet?" And about 2 years ago, I just said, "Stop. We don't say that anymore because we just are. We are who we are," and that speaks partly to the language of, you know, who's the winners, who's the losers, who's gentrifying, who's not, who's the poor neighborhood, who's the good neighborhood, who's the bad neighborhood. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to the language that's underneath the quality of my neighborhood, which is the community engagement and the community building work that's become much more in vogue these days, and how connections change and affect quality of life when neighbors are connected with one another.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear it.
Just talking about community engagement and the community and how people are attempting to build a stronger sense of neighborhood commitment and confidence, right? And how we can do that.
In terms of the planning function of the planning being community, speaking in terms of community building and community engagement, and creating connections between neighbors as a way to improve quality of life, rather than so much focus on the built environment.
Well, I'm just going to say a few things. Go. Do you want to start, Norm? Go ahead.
If the issue is building support for the community and faith in the community, community organizing should play a role in that process. And there are some examples of community organizations in Cleveland that have been in business going back to the 70s, in my knowledge, that are still in business and provide block clubs and annual meetings and dinners and that sort of thing as a means of cementing the elements in the community together. Block Watch is a feature of that, and any number of other kinds of social development issues that come out of good community organizing. So that's something that I don't think should be overlooked.
I agree completely. And you know, we live in this digital age where people are online, you know, walking around looking at their phones, right? And you can connect with anybody across the globe in a nanosecond. And you know, but it's true as it's ever been. Face-to-face relationships are just as important as they've ever been. This local relationships in community where people are relating to each other is as important as it's ever been. We've talked about how e-commerce is killing bricks and mortar retailers, and you know, we're losing all of these shops. It turns out that some bookstores which promote, you know, book readings and, you know, getting together, and it turns out that coffee shops are proliferating because people like to hang out in coffee shops. It turns out that farmers markets are proliferating, and research on all of these phenomena, farmers markets, coffee shops, they promote human interaction and human community. That craving people have to have a connection is still as important than ever. And the way you build your community, do you have third places where people can get together? I love it. My community, I go to a coffee shop, there's a place up the block I go to, and you can just sit there and hang out, and some of your friends come by, you know, and you need places like that. And a lot of low-income neighborhoods do not have even a coffee shop or a cafe where people can hang out, or a park, or a theater, or whatever it might be, right? The way you physically develop. And cities, the way cities have been traditionally built facilitate human interaction. That's what they're good at, getting people to have serendipitous encounters, right? So they can begin to form relationships, and that happens in cities. And this idea that somehow cities are passé because of the digital age is simply false. People still crave that. It's still important. And you can do it deliberately. You can do it through community organizing, and you can do it through building, right, a community garden, which is the center of many neighborhoods in St. Louis, where the community garden has become a social gathering place.
It is in Cleveland as well.
Thank you for this great lecture and organizing this dialogue. I really appreciate it. I'm a planner for the city of Cleveland, and I have a question about some of the neighborhoods I plan for. Two of them are Ohio City and Tremont. And what I've noticed throughout several years of working in these neighborhoods, first at a CDC and then now at the city of Cleveland, is as projects come in, as private market rate development is taking hold and being developed, again, on vacant lots, sometimes at the result of, or at the cost of demolition of existing housing, the residents that are moving in, they're coming back in from, as you mentioned in your lecture, from areas in the suburbs or from other cities. And I've noticed through that movement that some of the behaviors and attitudes that we see in the suburbs that are challenging to cities, the idea that I have to drive everywhere to get to where I'm going, or the desire to store your car on the street or privately at your destination, is putting a pressure on some of these neighborhoods to adapt the physical built environment, really the cities, the public realm, the right-of-ways, to accommodate that need. And my question is, do you see that as an appropriate response for that strong planning institution, that strong community institution, or is there some other way to think about it? And particularly, how can that be addressed through an equity lens in a city like Cleveland, where a quarter of residents don't even own a private vehicle? Thank you.
I'm sorry. I must apologize to the audience. It's been 50 years since I was director in Cleveland, and as the years have encroached, my hearing has declined, so I'm not hearing all of this. So I'm getting a translation, and then maybe I'll be in a position to respond. Well, thanks.
The new residents in cities often have a suburban mentality and want to have the accommodation of their automobile, right, and accommodation of what you might call a suburban lifestyle. So let me take a quick crack at this. What I think is fascinating lately is Minneapolis versus Des Moines. Minneapolis recently did away with single-family zoning within the city of Minneapolis, which means that you can have up to 3 and 4 units on every single plot of land in the city. That's going to increase density. I got friends, I grew up in the Twin Cities, and friends called me, this is going to be a problem, what about parking and stuff? I think it's great. I know that we should be concerned about issues of parking and that, but density promotes transportation, which reduces the burden on low-income households, and we can have more robust public transportation. So I'm definitely in favor of moving toward not accommodating the automobile, but accommodating urbanism, right? The mix of uses, the density, the connection among land uses. Des Moines, Iowa is considering just the opposite, passing a zoning law which will make all new development in the city of Des Moines look like suburban development. Be at least this big, at least as big a lot, right? I think we can't compete with the suburbs, folks. If you want to compete with the suburbs, they're going to beat us every time. You know, the inner cities, right? You might as well do our strength. Our strength is urbanism. So my advice to you is don't buy it.
Urbanism as density.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you were looking at the city of Cleveland, for example, you could imagine a future city with Euclid Avenue as the main high-density core running from Public Square to University Circle, maybe with megastructures. Believe it or not, a guy named Little, well, it wasn't John, there was in the 1969, I know this is ancient history to many of you, but in 1969 there was a show at the Museum of Art, and the Museum of Art was conceptualized visions of Cleveland in the future. And one of the small sketches that was in that show was exactly that, a megastructure, that is to say, a Le Corbusian multi-use structure that stretched from Public Square to University Circle and encompassed in that most of the population and most of the land uses of the city. And large areas of the rest of the city were in public parkland. Now, I don't imagine quite that, but at the same time, the point that is made here, that density is very, very important in terms of resource saving, and in the face of climate change, is a very important issue that's going to be becoming more and more significant in the future. And it is likely that cities will go the direction that we're talking about here, increasing density, increasing multi-use, and downplaying the role of the automobile, and going for alternative transportation solutions.
Hi. So I guess I kind of have two questions, but I guess one, maybe you can just clarify before I ask. You were talking about concentrating resources, and I was just wondering, did you mean like within the city itself? Like, so it's not like spread across, like, did you mean within certain neighborhoods in the city, or did you mean concentrated resources like across the city itself?
I meant to say that in areas that have extremely weak markets, if you're going to do development, you're going to have to engage in some real targeting of resources. If we had a munificent federal government who gave us sufficient resources, maybe we could attack the whole north side of St. Louis. But without that, we're going to have to use our limited resources in a very targeted way that can jumpstart the market before we build housing, right? So that's what I meant by that. And by the way, that's a political problem. We all know that. That aldermanic, ward-based politics tends to spread things around. It's very hard to get that kind of targeting we're reducing the size of our board of aldermen, but...
Same problem in Cleveland. You have to strategize about that, and in general, the planning strategy has been find a strong point, a solid development, a solid activity, and build off it. In other words, build around it and then spread out into the surrounding community. That's been a sort of a central kind of an objective. But if you look at it the way I tried to explain it earlier, with these three classifications, solid, upper income, middle class, potential, but floating on the line, and lower income, the focus of most development activity has to be, in my judgment, in the middle.
So, okay. So if it has to be in the middle, how do you explain suburbia? Like, isn't that just the very definition of the peanut butter spreading that you were talking about doesn't work? I mean, it absolutely worked for suburbia. It's been working for the past 50 years. So why couldn't a similar concept be applied to cities instead of having all these, pockets in the city where, like you say, the market is, suffering or it's not doing well? Why isn't there more sort of peanut butter investment within the city limits as opposed to just taking everything out to the burbs, including jobs and, all that kind of stuff, resources?
This is an interesting question, probably raises some sort of profound issues, but I think that suburbanization was one moment in history when a very wealthy society found that you can live on, 3/4 acre lots with everything serviced by the automobile, with cheap gasoline, with cheap mortgage credit, with no concern about the environment, so I think that that principle, and by the way, that principle was driven in part by racial fears that came from that constellation of forces I talked about, right? At one point in the 50s and 60s, that kind of perfect storm of development, and people still have tremendous fears racially that partly stem, if you read Segru's study of Detroit, The Origins of the Urban Crisis, he says that racism historically learned and is actually materialized in neighborhood development. So people see it and they go, of course, I've got to move away from immigrants and African Americans and Latinos, right? Because that leads to downward mobility of the place, right? Well, I don't think we're there now. I think there's a different dynamic going on.
I would disagree with Todd on one point. I don't envision the abandonment or the quasi-abandonment of the suburbs. There's much, much too much of an investment in infrastructure and people's lives and fortunes and so on. The suburbs, to some extent, are going to be with us for as long as the foreseeable future. But the focus in the future, I agree, is going to be more and more urban. And it's going to be more and more urban because climate change, I think, alone will demand the most efficient use of energy. And heating energy and energy in general is best served in a high-density situation. And that's what I think the city is going to be more and more Corbusian in the future.
Todd, in your research, have you come across strategies that allow low-income residents to share in the growing creation of wealth in communities that are coming back? I'm thinking here of limited equity co-ops.
Yeah, there are lots of instances. Ultimately, it boils down to ownership of the land, right? Who controls the land controls largely whether you can benefit or not benefit from the neighborhood going up, right? So if people from outside own the land, they're going to take that profit and take it elsewhere. So, limited equity co-ops are something that has been tried, and it's a relatively small phenomenon, but where it has been tried, it works. The problem there is that it limits equity appreciation, right? So you can't tap that equity. And in some ways, as I talked about, a TIF policy, right? Whereas land values go up, you're able to tap that under an increment to subsidize affordable housing, which could be owned by the people themselves, right? So, limited equity co-ops, I'm in favor of them, and they do provide perpetually affordable housing within neighborhoods that are coming up, but they have the drawback that you're not able to tap into that rising equity over time. So over time, it would become more and more of a kind of a tension there, right? You have this piece of property that might be worth ultimately 5 or 10 times what was originally paid for, right? And that people can only get so much, usually adjusted for inflation.
I don't think that's going to fly. I don't think it's going to fly on any large measure, because there is this notion that people would like to have their property appreciate, but at the end of the property appreciation, they want to be able to leave something tangible to their heirs. And in order to do that, they're going to have full title.
I want to thank you guys for your time. Again, thank you for your thought leadership and for being here and present with us. If we can give a round of applause again, please.
Do we go off, or do we go off, or does Dennis stay?
I am Dennis Keating. I was asked to make a few brief comments emphasizing the brief, and we are coming to the end here, and there is a reception afterwards. So I'll just point out a few things. I first want to acknowledge, like Chris, that it was a real honor during my academic career here at the Levin College to collaborate with Norm on a lot of writing about the very subjects that have been discussed tonight. I think I would emphasize the difference, as Todd was talking about, the nuances of the idea of gentrification, particularly in cities like Cleveland and St. Louis. There's gentrification, and then there's gentrification without displacement. In cities like St. Louis and Cleveland, we've had so much vacant land from years of depopulation and neglect, urban renewal, and other factors that there might be slight signs of some form of what people think of as gentrification, as Todd defined it, in a few neighborhoods, but nothing like a major issue as it is in the coastal cities, where it's at least occurring in some, although not a whole lot of neighborhoods. I would say the most significant figure mentioned tonight is what Chris mentioned in his comments, and Eric Hodderson, who might not be here anymore, but pointed out to Norm and I before we came down here in the current special report of the Economist magazine. They point out that Cleveland, Ohio leads the country #1 in child poverty. 51% of the children in Cleveland living in poverty. It seems to me, even in the neighborhoods, Norm mentioned Tremont and Detroit Shoreway, that are doing much better, they still have extremely high rates of poverty, just like the rest of the city as a whole. And we shouldn't forget that. I think urban planners have not historically focused on things like education and poverty related to education, preschool, kindergarten, and other policies that might at least somewhat alleviate the problem, but they should. Not very far from where we are over in the central neighborhood, arguably the poorest neighborhood in the city of Cleveland, highest concentration of poverty in public housing in the state of Ohio. When I came here in 1983, a few years after Todd, a lot of that neighborhood, other than the public housing projects, was vacant. Now it's mostly filled, not with upper income gentrifiers, but pretty modest and middle income housing. They live side by side. I don't think there's a whole lot of interaction or integration. But that neighborhood was designated under the Obama administration as a promised neighborhood. Many institutions, including Cleveland State University, were involved and are involved still in trying to help the children of the central neighborhood do better. There is no more promised neighborhood program federally, but I think that's the kind of issue that really has to be emphasized in cities like Cleveland and St. Louis, neighborhoods like that are at mixed income but have high rates of poverty, or even in neighborhoods that are doing better, still have high rates of poverty. Hundreds of urban planners are going to be here in Cleveland the rest of the week from the state of Ohio. I would hope that they would, like Norm had in his career, talk about issues of poverty and what might be done, whether it's urban planning departments or at least city governments that need to pay attention, not just anti-poverty agencies where they still exist. There is the United Way in Cleveland, which announced its #1 priority was to deal with the root causes of poverty now. And we've had a lot of discussion, particularly in the community development community, about inequality. Even in the presidential campaign so far, at least the word inequality has been an issue, not so much poverty. So my message would be we need to focus in both types of neighborhoods, whether gentrifying or not, the root causes of the despair that features a lot of those neighborhoods, and particularly, as Norm mentioned, in the African-American neighborhoods of Cleveland, and likewise, I believe, in St. Louis. So with that, I think we're adjourned. Thank you to our panel and to Todd Swanstrom. Thank you for coming. And there is a reception over there. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I do. Oh,
You got it? Yeah, I got it. We got a little duet going here.
Oh, thank you.